Hey everybody, I'm Michelle and this is Pretty Petticoat Sewing. We are on to the next step on our blue and gold Italian Renaissance gown series, our costume series. And this is what we're working on today. We are working on the gauntlets. In fact, we're working on one gauntlet because I'm not going to make you sit through me making two gauntlets. So I'll make one on camera, the other off camera, and then you'll get to see the final result afterwards. So what I did was I took my pattern piece, which is this piece right here, and I cut out, sorry, I wanted to hold that up where you could see it, and I cut this out on the fold right here in everything that I needed. So I cut it out in my lining, the silk de peony that I'm lining it with, and I also cut it out in the upholstery fabric for the outside and cotton denim for the inside to interline it and give it a little bit more sturdiness, okay? So the first thing that I did, which I did off camera, is I took the interlining and the outside fabric, we normally call this the fashion fabric, but this upholstery fabric, and I sewed them together so that this is now one piece, okay? So that was the very first thing I did. And the next thing that we're going to do with these, and gauntlets are, these particular gauntlets are actually incredibly easy. I just want to take my ruler here and making everything move. Okay, so the very first thing that I'm going to do is take my ruler and I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch from the edge right here, so that that is where I can put my piping, that 1/2 inch mark right there. And I like to start with each edge because the long edges are much easier to mark than the curves. And I'm going to show you how I mark the curves too, which I did not show you on the neckline. So I would like to show you how I do that here. Oh, nope, that is definitely not correct. I got it correct about halfway up. All right, so right there. Okay, so on the curves, I like to take my, I hope I have it over here. I didn't lose it somewhere. I want to take my, well, usually I take my tape measure and use that, but I don't know what I did with it. So I guess we're going to skip that part for now. But basically, we're just going to do the same thing that we did on the neckline. We are going to sew this around the edge with our piping, the cord part of our piping, lined up right at that, so that our sewing line is right at that 1/2 inch mark. And the reason that we want to do that is to make sure that when we sew the seam and flip this right side out with the lining in it, that it all lays nice and flat and that the seam is right against this so that it's nice and solid right there on the edge, okay? So first thing I'm going to do is go through and pin all of this down right where I want it to be. So we did this last time, and I know you probably loved how boring it was, but again, I will tell you the same thing that I have said in the past. This is a little bit of a boring part, but when you see me finish all of the pinning, that you can just fast forward until I'm done with the pinning of this piece, and then we'll be on to the next step, okay? Now, if you are interested in hearing me babble little tips and tricks as I go along, don't fast forward, take a look, see what I have to say. But if you're just here to see the finished product, feel free to zoom ahead and take a look at how it turns out. Now, for those of you who know my channel so far, you know that that I just film everything in one fell swoop. Someday I am going to hire someone to do the thing, the technology that I am not quite at, and then maybe it'll be a little easier on some people that don't want to see all the how-tos. If you want to see the how-tos, generally I would say come to my Twitch channel and watch me there, because I do like to just describe what I'm doing or answer questions if they come up while I'm working. So if you're wanting like absolute detailed explanations or tutorials on how to do some of this stuff, absolutely come see me on Twitch at twitch.tv/prettypetticoats, if you're on Twitch. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them below, or on Facebook. If you'd like to find me on Facebook under Pretty Petticoats, you can also put questions there, and I'm happy to answer any of them. Generally, the consensus is that I talk way too much, so I'm trying to find just a 1/2 inch. I don't want to do this with my ruler because it's entirely too big. But we're going to do about a 1/2 inch. It's going to be about that far. All right. So normally I'm pretty good at guesstimating this, but I feel like I shouldn't teach people bad habits right out of the gate. Another thing that you can do is lay this down and measure a 1/2 inch from the seam that you sewed the piping in with. Just measure a 1/2 inch out and mark that line, and then line it up with the edge of your piece that you're putting it on. So there are a lot of different ways to do this. Don't feel constrained by the way that I do it. In fact, don't feel constrained by the way anyone does it, because sewing should be fun. I think that you should at least try to enjoy it a little bit as far as that goes, because, you know, this is supposed to be a good time for you, not a time in which you want to, murder someone. So try to enjoy your sewing as much as you can. Perfect. All right, so now this is a 1/2 inch, so I'm just going to mark myself a little tiny 1/2 inch. I cheat all the time with stuff like this, so if you have little things laying around, this piece right here is 1/2 inch, so I'm just using that to mark a few spots to keep this nice and in line, and we're going to go from there. So all sorts of ways to cheat if you need to. I do usually use my measuring tape, and I actually use my measuring tape while I'm sewing it instead of actually drawing on it at all, but you can do this in a whole bunch of different ways, and I'm probably right in front of the camera, so I'm going to try to make sure that you can still see what I'm doing. I showed in part 2 how to sew the how to cut bias, sew bias, and make piping. So if you want to learn how to do that, go ahead and take a look at the second part of the series. I know that's where the little mini piping tutorial was when we made the piping in the first go. So if you are interested in a little bit more explanation of how I made the piping, go there, take a look. It's super easy. I love making piping. It's so relaxing, so easy to do. What I'm also doing here at the corners, you saw me do this, is I'm clipping this so that this will curve as it's supposed to around that corner, okay? So I'm going to move this around just a little bit further, and I actually, hopefully I measured it right. I made sure in advance that I had plenty of piping to go around this so that I wouldn't have to stop and make more. So hopefully this is going to be completely all set. So, and again, I'm sorry that my hand is in the way. I think the camera may be on the wrong side for this particular type of run, but you can see it as I'm going. I am pinning right up against that piping, right where my stitching line is, so that I can go back over that stitching line when I do that. I'm going to hang on to this because I'm going to need it for the top, but for this edge, I've already marked it, so I'm just going to line it up. And I am doing this a little bit by feel and a little bit by actually lining it up. So, you know, obviously do what is most comfortable for you to get this lined up. And you know, again, there's so many ways to do so many pieces of sewing, different ways to do a whole bunch of different things. So if you need to find another way to do this because it's easier, easier for you to do, certainly, like, don't, again, I'm just going to keep saying this forever, don't let yourself get boxed in to a certain particular way of sewing things, because you know, there's a lot of different ways. There's different ways to make bias tape. There's different ways to cut bias strips. There's different ways to sew seams. There's different ways to pin things. I cut backwards from essentially almost everyone I know. I cut the wrong direction. Like, there's so many different ways to do this. So certainly don't ever let yourself feel as if you're boxed into a specific way of doing things, because there are definitely other ways to do each kind of part of your sewing, okay? So now as we get up here, it's going to get a little trickier. And the reason that it's going to get a little trickier is simply because these are really sharp curves. So there's going to be a couple more clips to make this work on the curves up here. I'm trying to stay on camera here, so let me just tilt it just a little bit more. All right, maybe there you go. Backing it up helps. Okay, so I'm going to put this over here. So for this side right here, we're going to try to, I'm going to give myself a few little marks to work with, just like I did before, just right here. And this is just, you don't have to do a bunch, you just have to do enough to get it lined up. And sometimes, especially if you use pencil like I do, sometimes that is not the easiest thing in the world to do. But if you just give yourself a little bitty mark, you should be good, okay? Now, so as you're going around this curve, like, it's very obvious that this is not going to curve around very easily there. It's going to pucker. So what I'm going to do is snip that, and I'm going to turn this so I can see it, because I certainly don't want to accidentally snip something else. I'm going to snip this just like if I was clipping a curve. That's exactly what this is. So I'm just going to clip a few little spots right here at this curve, just so that this, you can't do too many really, just don't cut through your stitches where you stitched the piping in. So I'm just going to cut a few, because I think it's going to have to roll right around here. And then I'm just going to, again, I'm just going to roll it around and line it up with that 1/2 inch mark that I made. So as you can see, when I did that, that snipping helps to keep it flat. So now we have this beautiful little curve that goes around there, and then there's another piece right here, again, curving. And you can see, just want to make sure I've got it down where I want it to. Yes. Okay, so you can see how those splits open up, and it allows this curve to be a lot smoother. So that's all I did. I just clipped the curves on that and then pinned it down. So that is all you have to do to make that work. And then I may have overdone it a little bit with the clippings. I probably needed 2 less than I clipped, but that's okay, because again, it does not, you can clip straight edges too. It's not going to change anything on the outside as long as you don't clip through your stitching. So all right, so I'm going to go right down to here, because that's another 1/2 inch mark that I marked right there. And then here, this is curving the other way. So it's going to lay flat, but this is going to get all puckery. So you're going to want to curve it around the way that you want to, and then clip that so that it can overlap each other and lay down the way that you want it to. So I'm going to do a couple more marks, because I did not go up this side. So, and I'm marking it where I can see it. So there's a couple of spots on this fabric where it's easier to see the pencil than others. So just trying to Trying to mark it as best I can. There we go. And then one more on this side should get me to the home run. Okay, there we go. Okay, so for this piece right here, this is the very bottom of this curve. So this piece right here, I'm going to clip right here. I'm going to be very careful not to clip this sleeve. I don't want to clip that, only the piping. And then I'm going to curve it right into that 1/2 inch mark. I'm going to pin it. Now, here's another thing, little tip for piping. Whenever you have something like this that's a continuous round and you don't have a place for the end to just disappear into a seam, you're going to want to fold it this way. Fold it this way, I say, and then I don't show you. So this is the piece right here. You want to fold it up and at an angle, just like that, nice and sharp. Okay, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to continue pushing this through, and I'm going to pin it down a little bit more just to make sure that everything stays where I want it to, because I do want this to be a little bit of a clean edge right here, so that whenever I sew the lining in and then have this as the seam allowance, I don't want this to be super bulky either. So I want to make sure that this kind of stays where it is and that this part that I've cut stays as flat as possible. Now I'm going to just cut off that end because I don't need it. It's going to be inside the seam allowance right there. That's going to go in the trash. Okay, and then I'm going to take this end and, oh, thankfully I made enough. And the same thing, I'm going to clip my curves. Don't cut your stitch line where you sewed the, go right up as close as you can get, but not too close. You don't want that to come out. So I'm just going to do 4 this time. So I actually think that's all I'm going to need. And then again, I'm going to follow my little 1/2 inch marks right around. And I can't tell you the number of times that I have pinned these things on the wrong way. I am pinning that the wrong way. So I'm going to move that out of the way and pin it the other direction. Because when I sew this on, I want to make sure all my pins are going the correct direction. Okay. So I hope you can see this. There you go. I'm just going to, again, wrap this around. And if it does that, if it starts to come up, just clip that as well. You just needed another clip right there. We might need another one here, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it now. So I'm going to roll this right around to that 1/2 inch line that I marked. And see, that will lay flat. Make sure I'm on my 1/2 inch mark as you roll it, because you made those little clips, okay? So I'm going to put that right there. And then a little bit more down here. This is going to go to this line right here. And another thing that you have to be careful of as you're going around these curves, of course, is that you don't want to let it get wobbly somewhere in the middle. Oops, that's not what I wanted. If it gets a little wobbly, not the good 1/2 inch mark, or if it gets puckered when you're pinning it, then it could turn out not great. So try not to let that happen. And I'm just going to keep following my marks right here. So one pin here. And I get a little fussy with these pins because I want them to be nice and up against the edge there, so that my seam allowance stays where it's supposed to and right up against the piping as well, so that everything is nice and neat. Now, when you get to the spot where you have this piece that was bent and folded up into the seam allowance, you're going to want to do the same thing with this, but you're going to want it to overlap this so that it's on the other side. That way they cross over each other. There's no gap in between them. If you put them right side by side, like this, then there might be a little gap in between them. So you want to overlap them. So I'm going to pull this pin out, and I'm going to cut this right here. It's a little longer than I need, but I'm going to give myself enough room to put this right up against there, and then, especially with a really good small gauge piping cord, this is relatively simple to do. Sorry. I am going to trim this down, but I'm not right now because I've got a pin sticking out of it, so I don't want to cut the pin. So I'm going to put this down, and I'm going to change my foot. So if you saw me do this in the second part of the series, I took my regular foot out, and I changed it with my zipper foot, which looks like this. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, white's better. There you go. You can see that. So, and this requires moving my, let's see, we're going to sew on this side. So it requires moving my needle a little bit, because the regular setting for my needle literally drops my needle right down the center of this thing. And it will just break your needle. So I am going to go on ahead, and yeah, right there, perfect. And at this point, I've done this so many times that I know what number it needs to go to, but sometimes I have to eyeball it little by little. So, all right, so in this case, I'm going to try to start right at the underarm, which is in this curve right here. So I'm going to go before the overlap of these two pieces over here, and I'm going to start here and go this way. So that means I'm going to pull this pin, because we don't want, and this pin, because we do not want, I think I have some pins backwards in here. It's okay. It will happen. I think it's the last 3 pins are backwards, so not the end of the world. But you're going to put your foot right up against the edge of your piping. So in this case, the piping is on this outside edge right here, and my needle is literally, and I'm sure you can't get close enough to see it, but is literally going down just inside the piping from the view that you can see. So the piping is here, and then my needle is just inside of it, okay? So I'm just going to stitch nice and close to that spot. I'm going to pull this up because I want to pull out this needle. But when I pull this out, I'm going to hold all of these folds where I want them to be, because I don't want them to come loose, okay? So let's put the pen away so I don't lose that in the fight. I'm going to go around this curve, and I'm going to go right up over, caught with a pen. I went right up and over that overlap, over the cord that was overlapped right there. So, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm staying right on the edge, right on the sewing line that I made for the piping itself. Just stay right there and keep working your way around. So that is what we're going to do here. And I'm taking out my pins as I get to the place where they are. I'm doing this faster than you may do it on the first or second time you try this, just because I've done this a bunch of times. But, you know, if you're not ready to go as fast as I'm going, take your time, go slow. I have a setting that I can change on my machine so that I can't go fast. That sometimes if I forget, I will turn that on so that I can try to keep myself going slower. I had it set to high, so I just turned it down, so I can't do that anymore. But I'm fairly confident with my zipper foot and the piping, so I tend to go a little faster than I think some people might go. So if you are not yet comfortable with that, don't go fast. Just slow down a tiny bit. Sewing, there's nothing wrong with sewing slower. I keep getting my shirt caught on the pins. Slowing sewer can definitely ensure that you get a nice straight line there, and that you're not sewing puckers or anything like that. So certainly you do not have to go fast. You can even slow it down more than this. And it will help you to keep an eye on that line that you're trying to sew and not, you know, wobble around a little. So if you have a little trouble with wobbling, feel free to slow down, do it a little bit slower than this. And I say, try to make it right on the first go, just so you don't have to take it out. I do not like taking things out, but you know, it does happen to the best of us. So I'm sure you will see at some point somewhere along the way, you probably already have, me having to rip seams from something. So just keep in mind that that may happen, and it happens to all of us. So now I'm going to go right down to this corner, and you can see it goes down to that corner and then it curves this way. So we're just going to move the foot up a little, and we're going to sew right around that curve, staying right up against that piping. I love sewing piping together. I love sewing piping on, because it's just, you have this like wonderful guide to just make sure you're sewing a straight seam. So I recommend it. So we're almost done here. We actually am halfway now. So, and we have one big long strip to go on this side, which is going to be really quick and easy. But again, we got to this corner. Stay right up against your edge there and curve around it just like so. Okay, I have a pin. And then so that's it. I've restricted myself. I can't go faster than that. That's as fast as I can go for this right now, and that's fine. That's it slows you down. It forces you to think about, you know, hey, am I going too fast? Am I making this wobble around where I don't want it to be? Is it going outside my 1/2-inch seam allowance? Am I stretching anything? So you really have a chance to think about it as the stitches are going by if you slow down a little bit. And I think I should probably slow down a heck of a lot more, but sometimes I get a little racy around these straight edges. So it is good to sometimes turn the machine down so that it can't go that fast. If you are just joining us and you haven't seen any of my other videos, my machine is named Astrid, and Astrid will not tell me if I am going too fast. So she loves to drive fast and will not say, hey, Michelle, you should slow down. So every once in a while, we do have to rein me in at the same time so that we do not make a mess. Ooh, caught my finger. As we are rolling around curves and stuff. So again, just want to make sure that's down so you can see what I'm doing. I'm right up against this piping all the way around this entire thing. Uh-oh. I forgot a pin. This pin needs to come out. Okay, that was the last pin. Of course, the last three, like I said, were facing the wrong direction, so a little bit harder to control. And that's where I started, so I'm going to go right to there and stop. And I am going to touch up this corner, this curve right here just a little, because I wobbled out a little more than I wanted to. And I really want this to be nice and tight right up against this. So if you think you're wobbling, just go back a little ways and just give it another go. This little tiny spot right there that I just wobbled, and I didn't want that to wobble, so I'm going to do that. All right, so now we have the piping sewn all the way around, and I'm just going to cut this tab right here that I sewed into my seam allowance. That's perfect. I'm going to cut that down. That will eliminate some of the bulk right there. Again, there's a little spot here that just needs a little clip so that it will lay flat. You might find some like that, so no big deal if you do. I'm gonna cut off this edge. There we go. And then everything will lay nice and flat right there so that whenever you This is it's going to have another ruffle here, so I'm going to cut it just a little bit further like that. And then that will make it lay nice and flat there, okay? So now the next thing that we're going to do, I just enough of that piping. There's not very much left, but save this because you can always use it for extra things. So now this is going to go on. Trying to think about this. This way. There we go. Okay, so this, I'm sorry, let's take one more step back. So the other thing I want to do is flip this over. And now because I had extra on my piping, extra allowance here, it is shorter than the actual seam allowance. So I'm actually going to very quickly just give a quick trim all the way around this, just to get it to be at that seam allowance instead of larger than that seam allowance. Don't cut the fabric that is the sleeve. You want that to stay the same size. Just cut the binding, the strips that you had the piping sewn to. Just cut that. Don't cut anything else, because you don't want to change the size of your sleeve. I'm sorry if I just rolled off camera here. There we go. Like, I know it's here somewhere. I can make it work. All right, so then we're going to put this right here. And be real careful when you go around your curves, that you don't cut your curves differently or anything like that, because like I said, you just want this to be right up in line with the edge of your sleeve, the way you cut it out with the pattern. And I like to do this just because it gives me that little extra bit of room to work with on my piping. And then I can trim everything down afterwards instead of worrying about that being an exact 1/2 inch measurement going around. So that's this. And sometimes your pieces, especially the clipped areas, might get turned underneath, so you'll have to make sure you pull those out. And just go gently around your curves. There we go. So you can see what I'm doing here. So I'm just going underneath and I'm grabbing it and pulling it out. And I'm also being really careful because I have more than once cut my fingers with these scissors. They're very sharp. So be gentle with your scissors. Sometimes you can roll it out and then just set it down and cut this way. And be careful when you're going over the cording that's in the seam allowance so you don't cut too hard and cut your sleeve, because you don't want to do that. And again, this is just a few little pieces. Got to get hold of them. Sometimes they're a little snotty, but just grab those right around these seams, these corners right here. Just slip around, and then when you're done, you will see that it's just right up against the edge, so everything is still nice and smooth. I have a spot right over here that I missed a little bit of, so I'm going to trim that off. And then once you do that, that just allows you to line the edges of the lining up in the correct place with your seam allowance. I cannot urge this enough. Please remember to leave a space open when you're doing this so that you can turn this inside out. I am going to leave this space up here open to turn it inside out, or right side out, I'm sorry, whenever I'm done. But don't forget to leave that space open or you have to take stitches out. So I am going to, right up here on these curves, because these curves were the trickiest part, is I'm going to start right up here and I'm going to do the same thing that I just did, which is pin right up, and I'm going to show you after I'm done because I want the light to do this for just a second. So if you can see that, that is my piping and that is my pin right up against the piping, and my lining is lined up right up against the seam allowance. And I'm just going to do that all the way around, and we're going to sew that together, except for this part that we're leaving open to turn it right side out. So I'm going to very carefully, and I'm going to just do this piece by piece, just to make sure, all the way from the top to the bottom, just make sure that it sits exactly where it's supposed to sit. Because there are always little tiny spots, and you can see there's a little spot right here that comes up a little too high. But in order to make that lay flat and line up around that, I had to let that overlap a little. So I am not concerned about that. It's less than 1/8 of an inch, I think. So we're just going to leave that as is. Then I'm going to come over here, and even though I am not going to sew here, I am going to put some pins here, bright yellow headed pins, to make sure I don't sew any further than right here. But I am going to make sure that it lines up the way I want it to, so that I don't have any puckering on my lining as I'm going. Okay, so I'm just going to pin one more, and I am this time trying to make sure that all my pins are going the correct direction. So this is a little bit better. All right. When you're using dress pins and you have thickness like this, sometimes it can really hurt your fingers. So be sure to give your fingers a rest if you need to as you're going along, because this can be uncomfortable as you're pinning. And in fact, if you want to just use bigger pins, you can also do that. So if I take, this is a quilting pin instead of a dressmaker's pin, and I'm just lining this up right against the edge here, and then I'm just pinning it into place. It's actually easier, so let's switch to that so that you guys don't have to sit through me stabbing myself near to death with these pins. So you might be able to see it a little bit easier as I'm going. So I'm going to smooth and pin right against that edge right there, and you can see that little ridge. And I'm going to do the same thing here at the top. I'm going to line it up, and I'm just going to pin right along that binding, that piping, not binding, sorry. And I'm just going to do that all the way around, and try to keep all my pins going the correct direction this time. So I'm just going to, I'm also making sure that there's no puckers in this, so I just took that out so that I could release that little pucker that was there. So I'm just smoothing everything nice and neat. I'm cleaning up any edges that I didn't get cut off here, which is also fine. And we will go right down the edge of this, just making sure that our seam allowance is lined up. These pins are easier to use. Sometimes I don't like to use them on silk just because they're thicker than the dress pins, but especially when you're doing something like this with a layer of denim and a layer of upholstery fabric and a layer of silk. It's actually 2 layers of silk for the piping and then another layer of silk. That can be really thick, and so sometimes it's a little easier to just skip over to the quilting pins and use those instead, just so that you're not destroying your hands trying to push dress pins through that much thickness. So, you know, don't feel bad if you need to switch to a different kind of pin for that part. I do it all the time. So I would try not to use bigger pins on areas that will show on the outside, just to make sure that you don't end up with like a hole that won't go away, you know, something like that. But overall, that is my suggestion. And also, if you are, I just realized that I'm probably boring you guys. I'm not even halfway around yet. So if you are ready to fast forward, the next step will start whenever I grab my machine and bring her back over here to sew this down. So you can fast forward to there if you would like. We went over this a little bit in the second part of this series when we were sewing the neckline, but we did not go into it in depth or anything, and I just feel like this is an easier, I'm pinning this down to keep it flat. I feel like this is an easier piece for you to get a good look at what I'm doing, so I decided to go ahead and show more of that process here on this piece than I did on the neckline. So, and again, you making sure you're lining everything up and that you're not leaving a big pucker in the middle. So you may have a tiny bit more overlap on the side whenever you get there. Don't panic, it's okay. As long as it is covering everything that it needs to cover, then you are good. Okay. And I perpetually, oh, I don't want to turn that way because I want my pens to keep going. So just make sure that I want to keep my pens going the same way. Now over here, yeah, it looks like I have like, I don't know, an 1/8 of an inch, maybe even a 1/16 of an inch extra over here. So sometimes that will happen. Just make sure you're leaving enough everywhere for your, I perpetually find sections of something that I think I cut out exactly the same. I used the same pattern. I checked them against each other. They looked exactly the same. And then I try to sew them together and something is strangely off somewhere. So this is lining up perfectly on this side and for whatever reason is 1/16 of an inch too big on the other side. So who knows? As long as it stays nice and flat, we're going to go with it. And go right on around. And like I said, we're going to leave the underarm section in that curve right here. We're going to leave this open so that we can flip this right side out. So I'm just smoothing everything up this way. Two or three more pins and we'll be ready to sew. If you sat through the long stretch of that instead of fast forwarding, I do not blame you if you fast forwarded, because sometimes I have to do that as well, because, you know, watching someone pin something is maybe not the most exciting thing in the universe, but I also like to make sure that while I'm doing it, I'm giving you little tidbits so that at least it's worth watching. All right, so we've got this, and I just want to do this tiny little curve at the top just to make sure that I can see that edge of my piping. And then I've got all of this ready to go. Now, you can take another, you know, sort of double look to make sure, be careful as you're smoothing that you do not stab yourself with a pin. But I do like to make, like I just did, but I do like to make sure that I don't have any big wrinkles in here or anything like that, that I'm not going to be, I just did it again, that I'm not going to be able to fix. So I'm going to start right here on this spot, and I'm going to do the same thing I did when I sewed the piping on. I'm going to put the foot on the inside of my piping on this seam allowance right here, and I'm going to sew right up against the piping. So here we go. For those of you who are coming back now, this is the next step after you pin everything down, is to come in here, and like I just said, I'm going to start right here on this side of this pin because I want to leave that curve in the middle open. I'm going to make sure that the foot is in the seam allowance. Let me move my hand. Make sure that my foot is in my seam allowance and that the piping is on the left side of the foot. That's how I have it set up at the moment. Mine can do either side. Yours might be able to do either side as well. So keep that in mind as you're working. I'm going to pull my pins out as I go, and I'm going to sew right up against this piping cord again, as close as you can without sewing the piping cord itself. It does get a little harder when you're doing a piece like this that is sandwiched between two things, which is one of the reasons why I really like to pin it, because then you can at least see that edge. If you pin right up against that edge, you can see it, and it helps you to keep your foot and your needle right up against the edge of your piping. And I'm trying to stay as close as possible, so I am going a little faster than I probably should at these corners, but I am being careful, so just try to be careful. Keep moving your foot as needed. And then So sometimes it takes a little practice, but usually it's pretty easy. Again, you're right up against that piping, and as long as you stay the course each time you put the piping, or each time you sew up against that piping and just sew nice and tight right up against the piping, then you're gonna have pretty much what you need right from the get-go. And it's gonna help keep your stitching straight. And of course, watch for puckering, because puckering could mean that you have something somewhere that's not right. You want to try to fix that before you sew the pucker in place. Okay, we are almost done. So this is lovely. I'm really excited about this. It's going to look so pretty when we get back. Woo! Again, careful with your pins because you're pulling them towards your fingers. So I poke myself on a regular basis all the time. So just make sure that you're being as careful as you can. And when you get to these corners, make sure that you stay right up against the piping. And that will make these corners nice and perfect as you're going along. Get right up to this. So right around that corner, okay. Sticking up, of course. Now again, the denim that I put in here made this nice and not thick, but nice and sturdy. And that's what I really wanted for this gauntlet. I didn't want it to be wobbly and have no real body to it. So and of course, as I said, if you want to go faster, if you feel comfortable, you can. I like going fast, but I'm gonna stick with the slow because it's helped me all this time to make sure that nothing is going wrong. So let's not tempt fate by speeding up. See, there's a little spot right here. You do not want that to happen. So there we go. So it was starting to creep inwards, so I just pulled it back out where it's supposed to be. And we are almost to the end here. And I have to say that I think that taking your time and doing these little, you know, extra careful steps for the detail work on dresses like this, or really dresses of any kind, especially with piping, just doing this kind of detail work and doing it carefully and making sure that everything lines up exactly where you want it to line up and nothing puckers or goes the wrong way, etc., can really make a huge difference with what you're sewing. I mean, this dress is going to be a little bit more elaborate and sort of crazy than I usually go with my costumes anyway, which is nice. I like getting outside of my normal box every once in a while. But even if you're not doing beading and fancy stuff, you can still make it look real nice with a little bit of extra effort in the little things like the piping or the bias tape, etc. So I just backstitched, and I'm going to cut my thread, and then we're going to pop this open, and then we're going to just turn this inside out. But before I turn it inside out, I'm going to clip my curves, I'm going to clip my corners so that everything turns nice and neat. So the first thing, again, you'll notice the whole thing fit perfectly. except for that part of the, just literally that's the only part right there. And the, what is that, a quarter of an inch, it's an eighth of an inch down here, but it's probably a quarter of an inch over here. But everything else was perfect. So I'm going to trim that up just to make sure that it doesn't bulk up the seam. Just trim it up as close as you can get without, you know, going too crazy with it. And then I'm going to just stooch down this way. And now at this point, it doesn't really matter if you clip a little bit of your sleeve or not, because you've already followed your seam allowance where you want it to be. So you could make your seam allowance smaller at this step. I am choosing not to. I want to have that there because I'm going to have some lacing in here, and I want to make sure that there is enough sturdiness in there to just hold everything in place. I do that sometimes. I don't think that the bulk is that much extra. Plus I'm going to be sewing down my top stitching, I should say, the entire outside edge, so it's going to have that extra little space in there to keep everything nice and neat. So now I'm just cutting my curves right here to make those corners nice and small. This is typically called clipping your corners. Everybody's heard of it, so I'm just putting that off so that that corner will go nice and smoothly. And then the other thing that I want to do is clip these curves, and I'm just going to clip them right from this side up to my seam allowance, right to there. And I'm going to do that all the way around on all the layers. My scissors are being a little angry with me. They're like, this is a lot of layers. But if you're real careful, you can get clipped right around there, preferably without cutting your fingers. And without cutting your stitching, try not to do that. The center fold, the center mark here is very thick because it has all that extra piping stuff in it. So I'm going to go there, and like I said, just all the way around all of these curves so that this all smooths down nice and even. And of course doesn't cut through your stitches. You don't want it to cut through your stitches. I'm going to be sending my scissors in to get sharpened this next week because, as you can see, they desperately need it. It has been quite a few years that they have just held up perfectly, and now they are ready to be sharpened. Okay, so I'm just going to give this a little snap over here to get some of that bits off. And then we're going to turn this right side out, and I'm going to show you how this turned out and what it looks like. Now you see I left this nice big open spot so I could get my hand in here, so it's a little bit easier to turn. So definitely leave yourself enough space that you can turn it without getting stuff stuck, okay? Now, also when you're turning it, do it gently. Just make sure that you're not yanking anything too hard and like ripping a seam or, you know, ripping a piece of your fabric or anything like that. You don't want to rip anything, and believe me, you can. So just try to be gentle with it. Sometimes piping just makes it a lot easier to turn something out as well. So, ooh, see, I almost ripped a seam there. You want to make sure you don't do that. So just work everything outwards slowly and steadily. And you will be the happier for it. Now, I am going to give this a quick off-screen iron because I want you to be able to see this nice and crisp before I do the top stitching. So give me 2 seconds for that, and it really doesn't take that long at all. remember when you're ironing it that you are ironing on silk, if you happen to be ironing on silk, that you don't want to accidentally burn anything. But you want to make sure that your binding is nice and flipped out, and then you also want to make sure that you've got that last little edge that you left open turned under in the perfect way, so that when you sew that down, it looks even with the rest of what you're working on. So I'm just gonna turn this in real quick. And that can be a little tricky. Sometimes I'll do it, it's fine, I can do it without ironing it. So, sorry, that took a little bit longer than I wanted, but here you go. So you can see the lining, the piping is perfect all around these edges. Look at those corners, everything. So just taking a little bit of time to put all of that together will help to keep that nice and even where you want it to go. And I didn't want to stand over there by the iron while I was doing this. So I'm just going to pin the front down real quick. There's just about 3 or 4 sections of pinning that I need to do right here, or 3 or 4 pins, I should say, not sections, just this little tiny 5-inch spot here. And I want to pin it down so that it stays turned under, so that I can sew it down without having anything sticking out whenever I do that. So I'm going to flip it over to this side, and I'm going to turn this under. Again, I just have to make sure that my corners are nice and clipped. There may be a spot that I miss here or there, so I'm just going to go back and clip it. And then you want to turn it under and line it nice and steadily, not steadily, nice and evenly up against your piping right there, so that it is lined up just as if it was sewn like the rest of it. And then I'm going to take another pin. Come on. All right, so I'm going to take a pin and pin that down so that now both pieces are pinned together, the lining and the outside, and that's all nice and straight, just like the rest. And I'm going to do that for the rest of this opening, and then I'm going to sew it down with a top stitch. And I'm just going to do a part of that for you right now so that you can see what the top stitch will look like as you are. And I'm just going to start over here outside of the pins that I've just put in. In fact, I'm going to start on this side because I want the piping to be on the outside of my foot. Okay, so I've still got my piping foot on, and I'm going to put my edge so that the piping is still right outside of my foot. And I'm just going to do a stitch right along, a straight stitch right along the edge of this through the entire layer of, entire set of layers of everything. Make sure that everything stays nice and smooth, so that, and don't backstitch on your top stitching, because you'll just have a spot that looks funny, so you don't want to do that. Again, I'm going slow because I don't want anything to get messed up. I'm keeping this nice and flat, and I'm just going on a straight line right along the edge of this, keeping my piping right up against the edge of the foot there. And you also want to make sure that you're not getting any puckering anywhere. So I'm gonna go a little faster here because I can, and then I wobble. No worries. It's just try not to wobble, but I decided to go faster. And then, okay, we'll slow down again. When we get to the corner, we're going to come down here, and we're going to just do the same inching around this corner that we did with all of the sewing of this corner. Just keep going right around. And this is very much something that you'll want to walk around these corners. That's what this is, just walking. Because that way you have a nice, gentle, steady curve that's not, you know, there's no angles in it that make it look funny or anything like that. So I'm going to do the other one as well, just so you can see. So I'm just walking this right around. If you want to pull this out the other side, you can, but just make sure that you keep everything nice and flat as you're going. Okay, I'm going to turn it again. I was watching a channel, a YouTube channel, and I wish I could remember the name. I really should write these down, but there was a woman that was saying that you're in control of the fabric. You get to tell it what it's going to do going through here. All you have to do is pay attention and tell it what to do. You can tell it to go straight. You can tell it to wobble around. You can, you know, tell it to make curves the way you want it to. So keep in mind, it's nice to know that you are in charge when you're when you're sewing. So this is a machine and you are in charge of it. So just keep that in mind. And that does include the part where you get to go as fast or as slow as you would like while sewing. Okay, so once I get right up here, I'm going to trim that. Now, whenever I sew the rest of this, I'm going to overlap my stitches onto those stitches so that it will lock it into place. But in the meantime, I'm just going to show you this. So it just gets stitched right along that edge. And you can see my corners, the stitching is nice and curved over here. There's no angles or anything like that, just because I forced it to walk around those corners instead of trying to, you know, let it do its own thing. So that's what it's gonna look like top stitched, and nice and smooth and steady. So whenever we put the rest of this together, which I'm still waiting for the grommets to come in, but when we do that, we're going to have grommets that are down this side and grommets that are up this side, and that is going to tie together on the top part of the sleeve. So the sleeve is actually going to be like this, and it will tie together on the top going all the way up the arm. So that is one of the gauntlets made, finished almost. We've just got a little bit up here to do, and this will be completely closed off, and then it will have grommets added to it, and we will have the first gauntlet completed, and the other is going to be done the exact same way, and we'll match it exactly. Okay, thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed learning the weird little trick for piping and corners. I hope that you are enjoying the series and the dress. I'm really excited about how well it's coming along. I am actually looking at the bodice right now, and it looks lovely, so I'm really excited. And I think pretty soon we're going to be moving on to the skirts, which means that the dress is going to start taking like real shape, which is going to be wonderful. So, looking at everything that I've got sitting here right now and the fact that the bodice is up there, I suspect that this is going to be part 3. You may see this probably in the middle of May. So I hope that your May is going well. I hope that you are ready to get back to the real world. I hope that you are staying safe and taking care of each other. And I hope that you come back to watch the next part of the series for making the blue and gold Renaissance dress, the Renaissance costume. I will leave all of the places you can find me below. And I think I've remembered everything. So there you go. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.